The afternoon light filtered through the blinds of my Portland apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor where Max used to lie. 3 weeks had passed since I'd carried his still body to Dr. Rivera's office. 3 weeks since I'd watched the life fade from those amber eyes that had looked at me with such trust for 12 years. I thought I had cried every tear, felt every stab of grief, processed every memory. I was wrong. I was cleaning out his things, finally finding the courage to pack away the toys that still smelled like him, the blankets that held the impression of his body, the food bowls that seemed impossibly empty. The apartment felt hollow without the soft padding of his paws on the floor, without his gentle breathing in the corner of my vision. Even the silence was different now, heavier, more permanent. That's when I noticed it again. The kitchen drawer that had always stuck slightly, the one Max used to scratch at whenever I was cooking. For 12 years, he'd done this same ritual. Every single time I stood at the stove, stirring pasta or flipping pancakes on Sunday mornings, Max would come over and gently paw at that drawer. Not begging for food, he was never a beggar, but just scratching. 3 soft taps with his right paw, then he'd sit and wait, tail wagging slowly, as if he knew something I didn't. I'd always assumed it was because I kept the good treats in there, the ones reserved for special occasions. But as I stood there now, looking at the slightly ajar drawer with fresh eyes, a strange pull drew me toward it. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. Inside, beneath the usual collection of kitchen gadgets, takeout menus, and rubber bands, my fingers found something I'd never noticed before. A small white envelope, yellowed at the edges, as if it had been there for a very long time. Written across the front in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it, were the words, "For when Max is gone." My heart stopped. I sank to the kitchen floor, the cool tiles pressing against my knees as I turned the envelope over in my shaking hands. How was this possible? When had I written this, and why couldn't I remember? The envelope was sealed, the glue still holding despite what must have been years of Max's persistent scratching. As I carefully opened it, a single sheet of paper fell out, along with something else, a small faded photograph. The photo showed Max as a puppy, all golden fur and oversized paws, sitting in this very kitchen on the day I'd brought him home. But it was the letter that made my breath catch in my throat. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the words seemed to come from a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. The letter was dated 12 years ago, just 2 months after I'd adopted Max. I began to read, and suddenly I was transported back to that time, to those early days when everything had been different, when Max had saved me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The letter started simply, "If you're reading this, then Max is gone, and you're probably wondering why you feel like half of yourself is missing. Let me remind you of something you might have forgotten in your grief." As I read those words, written in my younger self's careful script, the memories came flooding back like a dam breaking. The Portland apartment filled with ghosts of the past, and I could almost see him again. That golden retriever puppy who had bounded into my life during the darkest period I'd ever known. I had forgotten so much about those early days, about how broken I'd been, about how Max had literally saved my life. The letter continued, and with each word I remembered more. The loneliness that had been eating me alive before Max arrived. The job I'd hated, the relationship that had ended badly, the crushing weight of depression that had made every day feel like a struggle just to get out of bed. I remembered writing this letter on a quiet Sunday morning, watching Max sleep in a patch of sunlight, suddenly overwhelmed with the realization of how much this small creature had already changed everything. But there was more in the envelope. Another photograph, this one showing scratch marks on the inside of the drawer. Deliberate, intentional marks that Max had made over the years. The letter explained it all. I had trained him to scratch at this drawer, had hidden this letter here as a time capsule, a message from my past self to my future grieving self. It was all coming back now, the memory surfacing like something rising from deep water. I sat on that kitchen floor as the afternoon faded into evening, reading and rereading the letter, understanding finally why Max had never stopped scratching at that drawer. He had been trying to remind me, trying to make sure I would find this message when I needed it most. The letter told the story I had somehow let myself forget. The story of how a broken man and an abandoned puppy had saved each other, and how that salvation had grown into something beautiful and eternal. As night settled over Portland, I realized that this was just the beginning. The letter was not just a message from my past self. It was an invitation to remember everything, to revisit the journey that had led us here. Max's goodbye was really a hello, a reminder of where our story had begun and why it would never truly end. Tomorrow, I would start from the beginning and remember how it all started with a phone call that changed everything. The letter in my hands transported me back 12 years to a different version of myself, one I'd worked hard to forget. It was March 2013, and I was living in a studio apartment in Southeast Portland, barely making ends meet on a technical writer's salary that barely covered rent and instant ramen. The Oregon rain had been falling for 6 straight weeks, matching the gray fog that seemed to have settled permanently over my life. I was 31 and felt ancient. My long-term relationship with Sarah had ended 8 months earlier when she'd decided she needed space to find herself, which I later discovered meant she needed space to find herself in Brad's bed, my former best friend. The betrayal had hit me like a freight train, not just because I'd lost the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, but because I'd lost my entire social circle in the process. Suddenly, weekends that had been filled with dinner parties and hiking trips became endless stretches of Netflix and takeout containers. My job at a small software company felt soul-crushing. I spent my days writing technical manuals for products I didn't understand, surrounded by coworkers who barely acknowledged my existence. I'd commute home to my empty apartment, heat up something from a can, and fall asleep watching late-night television. The weekends were the worst, 48 hours of silence that stretched endlessly. I remember that particular Thursday in March because it was the day I'd called in sick for the 3rd time that month, not because I was physically ill, but because the thought of getting dressed and pretending to be functional felt impossible. I was lying on my futon, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, when my phone rang. "Is this David Chen?" The voice was warm, professional, with a slight southern accent. "Yeah," I mumbled, not bothering to sit up. "This is Jennifer from the Oregon Humane Society. I'm calling about your application from last month." Application? It took me a moment to remember. I'd filled out some forms online during one of my late-night internet spirals, probably after watching some dog video that had made me momentarily think a pet might fill the void in my life. I'd completely forgotten about it. Oh, right. The dog thing. Well, I have some good news. We have a dog that might be perfect for you. His name is Max, and he's been returned to us twice now. He's a beautiful golden retriever, about 8 months old, but he's been having some behavioral issues that have made him difficult to place. I sat up slightly. What kind of issues? Jennifer's voice became gentler. He's got severe separation anxiety. Both families who adopted him brought him back because he would howl and scratch at doors when left alone. He's destroyed furniture, had accidents in the house. He's clearly traumatized from being abandoned so many times. We're looking for someone who works from home or has flexible hours, someone patient enough to help him heal. I looked around my depressing apartment. I had been working from home more often lately, mainly because I couldn't face the office. "I work from home sometimes," I said, which was technically true. "Would you like to meet him? I should warn you, he's not like the happy, playful dogs most people want. He's scared, defensive. It's going to take someone special to help him trust again." Something in her words resonated with me. A scared, defensive creature who'd been abandoned multiple times? I could relate to that. "Yeah," I heard myself saying. "I'll come in tomorrow." The next day, I drove to the Humane Society through the persistent Portland drizzle. The building smelled like disinfectant and hope, filled with the sounds of barking and meowing. Jennifer met me at the front desk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and paint-stained fingernails. "He's in the special care section," she explained as we walked down a hallway lined with kennels. "Fair warning, he doesn't warm up to people quickly." We stopped in front of a kennel in the back corner, away from the main traffic. Inside, pressed against the far wall, was the most beautiful dog I'd ever seen. His golden coat was lustrous despite his obvious stress, and his amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human. But those eyes also held something else, a deep, profound sadness that I recognized immediately. "Hey there, Max," Jennifer said softly. The dog didn't move, didn't wag his tail, didn't show any of the typical excited behaviors I'd expected. He just looked at us with those haunted eyes. "Can I go in?" I asked. Jennifer unlocked the kennel. "Go slow. Don't try to pet him right away." I entered the small space and sat down on the concrete floor, ignoring the dampness seeping through my jeans. Max watched me warily, every muscle in his body tense and ready to flee. We looked at each other in silence for several minutes. "I know how you feel," I whispered, surprising myself with the words. "I know what it's like when everyone leaves." Something shifted in Max's expression. His ears, which had been pinned back against his head, relaxed slightly. I extended my hand, palm up, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, he took one tentative step forward, then another. When he was close enough, he sniffed my hand carefully, then looked directly into my eyes. In that moment, I saw myself reflected in his gaze. The fear, the abandonment, the desperate hope for someone who might stay. Neither of us was looking for a pet and an owner. We were both looking for someone who understood what it meant to be left behind. "I'll take him," I told Jennifer, my voice stronger than it had been in months. The paperwork took an hour. Jennifer went over Max's medical history, his dietary needs, his triggers. She gave me a bag of food, a leash, and a folder full of training resources. But most importantly, she gave me a piece of advice that would echo in my mind for years to come. "He's going to test you," she said as we prepared to leave. "Dogs like Max, who've been abandoned before, they'll push boundaries, act out, make you want to give up. It's not because they're bad dogs. It's because they're terrified of being hurt again. They'll try to make you leave before you can abandon them. Don't let him win that game." I looked down at Max, who was sitting pressed against my leg, the first physical contact he'd initiated. "I'm not going anywhere," I told him. And for the first time in months, I meant something I said. The drive home was quiet, except for Max's anxious panting from the passenger seat. I'd put a blanket down for him, but he spent the entire 20-minute drive pressed against the door, as far from me as he could get. Every time I glanced over, those amber eyes were watching me, waiting for the moment I would inevitably disappoint him. When we arrived at my apartment, Max hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into my space would make the eventual abandonment hurt more. I sat down in the doorway and waited. After 10 minutes, he cautiously stepped inside, staying close to the exit, ready to bolt if necessary. That first night, he didn't eat. He didn't drink water. He didn't explore the apartment or show interest in the toys I'd hastily bought on the way home. He simply sat in the corner furthest from me, watching my every move with those eyes that had seen too much disappointment for such a young life. I made dinner, actual dinner, not microwaved leftovers, for the first time in weeks, partly because I wanted to establish normal routines for Max, but mostly because his presence somehow made the effort feel worthwhile. As I cooked, I talked to him, telling him about the apartment, about my work, about anything that came to mind. He never responded, but I noticed his ears would perk up when I spoke directly to him. Little did I know, as I fell asleep that night with Max still stationed in his corner, that this scared, abandoned dog would become my teacher, showing me what it meant to heal, to trust, and eventually, to love without fear. The first 2 weeks with Max were like living with a beautiful, haunted ghost. He moved through my apartment like he was afraid his footsteps might disturb something, eating only when he thought I wasn't watching, drinking water in quick, guilty gulps as if he might be punished for basic survival needs. At night, I would find him curled up in different corners, never the same place twice, as if he was afraid to claim any space as his own. I started working from home full-time, telling my boss it was a productivity experiment. In reality, I couldn't bear the thought of leaving Max alone for 8 hours after Jennifer's warnings about his separation anxiety. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been isolating myself from the world for months, and now I had a companion who was terrified of being left alone. Those early mornings were the hardest. I'd wake up and find Max sitting by the front door, perfectly still, watching and waiting. I realized he was anticipating abandonment, expecting me to leave and never come back like everyone else had. The weight of that expectation, that certainty of disappointment, broke something inside me. "I'm just going to the kitchen," I'd tell him whenever I moved around the apartment. "I'm making coffee. I'm checking email. I'm not leaving." I felt ridiculous talking to a dog who wouldn't even look at me directly most of the time, but something told me he needed to hear it. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning during the 3rd week. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, actual breakfast, which had become part of my new routine, when I heard a sound I'd never heard from Max, a soft whimper. Not distressed, but questioning. I turned around to find him standing about 10 feet away, closer than he'd ever voluntarily come. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly, not moving toward him. "You hungry?" He took one tentative step forward, then another. His amber eyes were fixed on my face, searching for something. Slowly, carefully, he approached until he was close enough that I could have reached out and touched him. Instead, I knelt down and waited. Max stretched his neck forward and for the first time sniffed my outstretched hand. Then, in a gesture so gentle it brought tears to my eyes, he rested his chin on my palm. The weight of his head in my hand was warm and solid and real. The first genuine physical connection I'd had with another living being in months. "There you are," I whispered. "I've been waiting to meet you." From that moment, everything began to change, but slowly, like ice melting in spring. Max started eating while I was in the room, though he'd pause frequently to make sure I wasn't going anywhere. He began following me from room to room, maintaining a careful distance, but no longer hiding. When I sat on the couch to work on my laptop, he would lie on the floor nearby, close enough to keep me in sight, but not close enough to be disappointed if I got up and left. I started taking him on short walks around the neighborhood, though walks was a generous term for our tentative explorations. Max would stay pressed against my leg, jumping at every sound, every car that passed, every neighbor who tried to pet him. But gradually, I noticed him beginning to lift his head, to look around with curiosity rather than just fear. It was during one of these walks that I met Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who lived in the house next to my apartment building. She was tending her garden despite the persistent Oregon drizzle, and she looked up as we passed. "That's a beautiful dog," she said, her voice warm and non-threatening. Max immediately tensed, but he didn't bolt. "His name is Max," I replied. "He's still getting used to things." Mrs. Patterson, who turned out to have an intuitive understanding of damaged creatures, didn't try to approach or pet him. Instead, she continued working in her garden, occasionally speaking to us as we stood on the sidewalk. "I had a dog like that once," she said, pulling weeds with practiced efficiency. "Rescue dog, scared of his own shadow. Took him 2 years to realize he was home for good." She glanced up at Max, who was watching her with cautious interest. "But once they figure out you're not going anywhere, they love harder than any dog you've ever known." Her words stayed with me as Max and I continued our routine of careful coexistence. I began to understand that healing, for both of us, wasn't going to be a linear process. There were good days when Max would greet me with something resembling enthusiasm, when he'd even wag his tail tentatively if I spoke to him in the right tone. But there were also setback days when something would spook him and he'd retreat to his corner, refusing to eat or engage, as if he was punishing himself for daring to hope. The real test came 6 weeks after I'd brought him home. I had to go to the office for a mandatory meeting, the first time I'd left Max alone for more than an hour. I spent the morning preparing him, explaining where I was going, showing him the treats I'd left out, promising I'd be back. "I'm going to work," I told him, the same way I'd been narrating my movements around the apartment. "I'll be gone for 3 hours. That's 2 naps for you." "I'm coming back, Max. I promise I'm coming back." He watched me put on my jacket with growing anxiety, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. When I picked up my keys, he ran to his corner and pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide with panic. The sight of him bracing for abandonment nearly broke my resolve, but I knew this was a test we both had to pass. "I'll be back," I said one more time, and left. The meeting was torture. I kept checking my phone, imagining Max destroying the apartment, howling until the neighbors complained, having accidents on the floor. I pictured coming home to find him catatonic with anxiety, convinced that his worst fears had been confirmed. The 3 hours felt like 3 days. When I finally returned, I climbed the stairs to my apartment expecting chaos. Instead, I heard nothing. I opened the door carefully, preparing for the worst. Max was sitting exactly where I'd left him, in the living room by the window, surrounded by his untouched toys and treats. He wasn't hiding in his corner. He wasn't destructive or panicked. He was waiting. The moment he saw me, his entire body seemed to exhale. His tail gave one tentative wag, then another, then began wagging in earnest as I approached. For the first time since I'd brought him home, Max came to me instead of waiting for me to come to him. He pressed against my legs, not frantically but firmly, as if confirming I was real. "I told you I'd come back," I said, running my hands through his golden fur. "I told you." That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed Max had moved his sleeping spot. Instead of hiding in a corner, he'd arranged himself on the rug beside my bed. Still not on the bed. That level of trust would come later, but close enough that we could see each other. "Good night, Max," I said, turning off the light. In the darkness, I heard the soft sound of his tail thumping against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. A golden retriever's way of saying goodnight back. I lay there listening to his quiet breathing, realizing that something fundamental had shifted between us. Max was beginning to trust me, but more than that, I was beginning to trust myself. For the first time in months, I'd made a promise and kept it. I'd committed to something beyond my own immediate needs. I was becoming the kind of person who could be depended on. Neither of us knew it yet, but we were both learning the same lesson, that sometimes the most important relationships begin not with love at first sight, but with the simple decision to stay, even when staying feels impossible. By the end of our second month together, Max and I had settled into routines that felt almost normal. He no longer spent his days pressed against walls, and I no longer spent mine wondering if I had the energy to get dressed. We were healing each other in ways that seemed almost accidental, through the simple act of showing up for each other every day. Our morning walks had evolved from anxious sprints around the block to genuine explorations of the neighborhood. Max had started to lift his head, to investigate interesting smells, to show glimpses of the curious, intelligent dog hiding beneath all that fear. I found myself looking forward to these walks, planning different routes, discovering parts of Portland I'd lived near for 2 years, but never really seen. It was during one of these expanded explorations that we found our place, Laurelhurst Park, just a 15-minute walk from my apartment. The park was sprawling and green, with paths that wound around a lake and through groves of old-growth trees. More importantly, it had a large off-leash area where dogs could run free. Max wasn't ready for off-leash freedom. He still needed the security of knowing I was anchored to him by his leash, but he loved watching the other dogs play. We'd sit on a bench at the edge of the off-leash area, and I'd watch his ears perk up with interest as golden retrievers and labs chased tennis balls and wrestled with each other. "You want to do that, don't you?" I'd ask him, and his tail would wag softly, as if he was admitting to a secret desire. It was at this park that we met Tom and his chocolate lab, Murphy. Tom was retired, probably in his late 60s, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from decades of dog ownership. Murphy was the opposite of Max, bold, friendly, immediately interested in making new friends. "Your dog's got good instincts," Tom said one morning as we watched Murphy bound toward a group of playing dogs while Max observed carefully from our bench. "He's studying them, learning their language. Smart dogs do that." "He's been through a lot," I explained. "He's still figuring out how to trust." Tom nodded knowingly. "The best dogs usually have. Murphy there was a stray for 2 years before I got him. Now look at him, thinks he owns the place." He glanced at Max, who was watching Murphy with something approaching longing. "Your boy will get there. Just takes time." These park visits became the highlight of our days. Max began to relax in that environment, his body language gradually shifting from defensive to curious. He started approaching other dogs, cautiously, politely, but with genuine interest. I watched him slowly remember how to be a dog, not just a collection of fears and survival instincts. The changes in Max were mirrored by changes in me. His daily needs, walks, meals, basic companionship gave structure to my days in ways I hadn't realized I desperately needed. I couldn't spend entire weekends in pajamas anymore because Max needed exercise. I couldn't skip meals because he needed to eat on schedule. I couldn't wallow in self-pity because he was depending on me to be functional. My work improved too. Having Max nearby while I wrote technical manuals made the tedious job more bearable. He'd lie on the rug beside my desk, occasionally lifting his head to check on me, his presence a quiet comfort. I found myself taking breaks to pet him, to talk through problems out loud, to step away from the computer and actually move around the apartment. The real transformation became clear during our 3rd month together, when my sister Amy called to check on me. Amy lived in Seattle with her husband and twin daughters, and she'd been worried about me since my breakup with Sarah. Our conversations over the past year had been strained, full of her well-meaning attempts to cheer me up and my defensive insistence that I was fine. "You sound different," she said, during what had started as a routine check-in call. "Different how?" "I don't know. Lighter. Less like you're carrying the weight of the world." There was a pause. "Are you seeing someone?" I looked down at Max, who was sprawled across my feet as I sat at my desk. "You could say that. I got a dog." "A dog?" Amy's voice brightened with genuine surprise. "David, that's wonderful. Tell me everything." I found myself talking for nearly an hour, describing Max's history, his progress, our daily routines. I told her about his fear of abandonment, his gradual trust, the way he'd started greeting me at the door with gentle enthusiasm instead of anxiety. I realized as I spoke that I hadn't talked this much about anything positive in months. "He sounds amazing," Amy said when I finally paused. "You know what I love most about this? You sound like you again. Not the you from after Sarah left, the real you, the one who used to call me excited about hiking trips and work projects and weekend plans." After we hung up, I sat with Max in the quiet apartment, processing my sister's words. She was right. I hadn't just been helping Max heal. He'd been helping me remember who I was before depression, and heartbreak had convinced me I was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unlovable. That night, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I called an old friend. Marcus had been part of the social circle I'd lost when Sarah and I broke up, but he'd reached out a few times, trying to maintain our friendship despite the awkwardness. I'd always made excuses, too embarrassed by my life's shambles to face anyone who knew me before. "David!" Marcus's voice was warm with surprise. "Man, it's good to hear from you. How are you doing?" "Better," I said, and meant it. "Actually, I have someone I'd like you to meet." I told him about Max, and Marcus, who'd always been a dog person, immediately understood the significance. "Bring him by this weekend," he said. "Sarah's got that barbecue, but screw that. Come over Saturday afternoon. Lucy's been wanting to meet your mystery roommate." Lucy was Marcus's golden retriever, and I knew Max would love her. As I accepted his invitation, the first social plan I'd made in nearly a year, I felt something shift inside me. I was ready to be part of the world again, and it was because Max had shown me I was worth staying for. The visit to Marcus's house was a revelation. Max, who'd been so fearful of new people and places, walked into their backyard with cautious confidence. Lucy greeted him with gentle playfulness, and within an hour they were chasing each other around the yard, while Marcus and I sat on his deck, drinking beer and catching up like no time had passed. "He's beautiful," Marcus said, watching Max finally engage in the kind of joyful, carefree play I'd been hoping to see. "But more than that, he's happy, and so are you." Driving home that evening, with Max panting contentedly in the passenger seat, I realized Marcus was right. I was happy. Not the manic, forced happiness I'd tried to manufacture in the months after Sarah left, but a quiet, steady contentment that felt sustainable. I had routines I enjoyed, a purpose that got me out of bed every morning, and a companion who was genuinely glad to see me at the end of each day. That night, as I was writing in the journal I'd started keeping to track Max's progress, I wrote something that surprised me. "I think we're going to be okay, both of us." Max was lying on his bed beside my desk, no longer in corners, no longer hiding. He'd claimed space in my apartment the same way he'd claimed space in my life, gradually, carefully, but completely. When I finished writing and turned off the desk lamp, he lifted his head and looked at me with those amber eyes that no longer held fear. "Good night, buddy," I said. His tail thumped against his bed, and for the first time, he rested his head on his paws and closed his eyes while I was still awake, trusting enough to be vulnerable while I watched. We had found our rhythm together, but the real test of our bond was still ahead, a test that would show us both what it truly meant to be a family. The call came on a Thursday morning in October, 6 months after Max had come into my life. I was at my kitchen table, laptop open, reviewing a technical manual while Max lay in his favorite spot by the window, watching the Portland rain create patterns on the glass. The phone's shrill ring startled us both. "David? It's Jennifer from the Oregon Humane Society." My heart immediately clenched. In the world of rescue dogs, calls from the shelter rarely brought good news. "Is everything okay?" "Well, that depends. I'm calling because we've had a rather unusual situation develop." Jennifer's voice carried a tension I'd never heard before. "Max's original owner has contacted us. She wants him back." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Max, sensing my distress, lifted his head and looked at me with those intelligent amber eyes. That's not possible. You said he was surrendered, that his family gave up their rights." "It's complicated," Jennifer sighed. "The woman who surrendered Max wasn't actually his owner. She was dog-sitting for her daughter, who was deployed overseas with the military. The daughter never authorized the surrender. She's been looking for Max for 8 months." I watched Max stretch and pad over to where I sat, pressing his warm body against my leg in the comforting gesture he'd developed over our months together. The irony was devastating. He was offering me comfort for news that would destroy both our worlds. "What does this mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "Legally, she has a strong case. Sarah Mitchell can prove ownership, registration papers, veterinary records, photos. She's been frantically searching for Max since she returned from deployment. David, she's his original family. She raised him from a puppy. Sarah." Even the name felt like a cruel joke from the universe. But he's been through so much. The abandonment trauma, the anxiety. We've spent months helping him heal. "I know. And from what I understand, you've done incredible work with him. But you have to understand, from her perspective, her beloved dog was given away without her consent while she was serving her country. She's been heartbroken." I looked down at Max, who was now sitting at my feet, studying my face with the intense attention he'd developed over our months together. He could read my emotions better than most humans, and he knew something was wrong. "When?" I asked quietly. "She'd like to meet this weekend, to see how Max is doing, to transition him back." After Jennifer hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, Max pressed against my legs, both of us processing this new reality. The dog who taught me about trust and healing was about to experience another abandonment, this time from me, the person who'd promised him I'd never leave. The next 3 days were torture. I found myself memorizing everything about Max, the way he tilted his head when I asked if he wanted to go for a walk, the soft sigh he made when he settled into his bed at night, the gentle pressure of his chin on my hand when he wanted attention. I took hundreds of photos, trying to capture every angle of his beautiful golden face, every expression that had become so familiar. Max sensed something was wrong. He became more clingy, following me from room to room with increased urgency, as if he was afraid I might disappear. His old anxieties began to surface. He stopped eating regularly, started pacing by the front door, watching me with worried eyes. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, typical for October in Portland. Jennifer met us at the park, where Max and I had spent so many happy mornings. She brought a woman in her early 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a University of Oregon sweatshirt. Even before Jennifer introduced her, I knew this was Sarah Mitchell. The way she looked at Max, with a combination of love, relief, and barely contained emotion, told me everything I needed to know. "Max?" she called softly, kneeling down about 10 feet away. Max's reaction was immediate and devastating. His entire body went rigid with recognition, his ears perked forward, and then he was moving, not running, but walking with a purposeful stride I'd never seen before. When he reached Sarah, he pressed his body against hers and made a sound I'd never heard from him, a whimper of pure joy and relief. "Oh, my boy," Sarah whispered, burying her face in his golden fur. "I'm so sorry. I looked everywhere for you. I watched my dog, no, her dog, reconnect with his original human, and felt my heart break in ways I didn't know were possible. Max was transformed in her presence, animated and responsive in ways that made it clear this was where he belonged. This was his real family." Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I can't thank you enough for taking care of him." "Jennifer told me about his anxiety, about how patient you've been. "He's a good dog," I managed to say. "The best. Would you like to hear about him? About what he was like before?" Sarah's offer was generous, and I could see she understood how much this was costing me. We sat on a park bench while Max lay between us, his head on Sarah's lap, but his eyes occasionally checking to make sure I was still there. Sarah told me about raising Max from an 8-week-old puppy, about his love for swimming in the Columbia River, about how he'd sleep at the foot of her bed every night. She showed me photos on her phone, Max as a puppy, Max hiking in the Cascade Mountains, Max wearing a ridiculous Halloween costume. "When I got deployed, I left him with my mom," Sarah explained. "But she got sick, cancer, and couldn't take care of him anymore. She gave him to my sister without telling me, and my sister—" Sarah's voice trailed off. She was going through her own crisis. Divorce, financial problems. She couldn't handle Max's anxiety when I didn't come home, so she surrendered him. The pieces of Max's story were falling into place. His separation anxiety wasn't just about being abandoned. It was about losing the one person he'd bonded with from birth, the person who'd never chosen to leave him. "I never stopped looking," Sarah continued. "I called every shelter in Oregon, posted on every lost dog website. When I finally tracked down what happened, the Humane Society told me he'd been adopted." She looked at me with genuine gratitude. "Thank God it was you. Jennifer says he's doing so much better." We spent 2 hours in that park, with Max moving back and forth between us, clearly torn but gravitating more and more towards Sarah as their reunion continued. I told her about his progress, his favorite toys, his walking routes, his friendship with Murphy and Tom. I gave her the bag of his food, his leash, his bed, all the physical remnants of our life together. "There's one more thing," I said, as we prepared to say goodbye. I pulled out the envelope from my kitchen drawer, the letter I'd written 6 months ago in a moment of overwhelming gratitude for Max's presence in my life. "I wrote this when I first adopted him. I wanted you to have it, so you know how much he meant to me." Sarah read the letter, while Max sat pressed against her leg, and when she finished, she was crying openly. "David, this is beautiful. You saved him, and from the sound of this letter, he saved you too." The goodbye was quick, partly because it had to be, and partly because Max made it clear where his loyalty lay. He came to me for one last head pat, one final moment of connection, but then he walked to Sarah's car and waited by the passenger door, ready to go home. "Take care of yourself, buddy," I whispered, kneeling down to his level one last time. "You're going home now. You're really going home." I drove back to my apartment alone, the silence in the car heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. The apartment felt impossibly empty. His food bowls still on the kitchen floor, his toys scattered around the living room, the indentation in his bed where he'd slept the night before. That night, I sat on my couch and cried harder than I had when Sarah, my Sarah, had left me. This was different, though. This wasn't the bitter tears of betrayal and rejection. These were tears of love, of gratitude, of grief for something beautiful that had ended exactly as it should have. I understood finally what it meant to love something enough to let it go. Max belonged with Sarah, and as much as it hurt to lose him, I was grateful to have been the bridge that carried him safely home. But Max's story wasn't over, and neither was mine. Sometimes the most important gifts we give each other happen long after we say goodbye. The months after Max left felt like learning to live with a phantom limb. Every morning, I'd wake up expecting to hear the soft padding of his paws on the hardwood floor, the gentle thump of his tail against his bed when he heard me stirring. Instead, there was only silence, a silence that seemed to echo through every room of my apartment. I kept his food bowls for weeks, unable to bring myself to put them away. His favorite tennis ball sat on my coffee table like a memorial, gathering dust but somehow still carrying the faint scent of his presence. Friends suggested I adopt another dog immediately, but the thought felt like betrayal. Max wasn't replaceable, and I wasn't ready to love something that much again, knowing how much it could hurt to lose it. Sarah had promised to send updates, and she kept her word. Photos arrived every few weeks. Max swimming in the Columbia River, Max hiking mountain trails, Max sleeping peacefully in what was clearly his rightful place at the foot of Sarah's bed. In every photo, he looked complete in a way I'd never quite managed to achieve during our time together. His eyes held the contentment of a dog who was exactly where he belonged. "He's doing amazing," Sarah wrote in one email. "It's like he never left. But I can tell you made a huge difference in his confidence. He's much braver now, more willing to try new things. Thank you for that." The updates should have made me happy, and part of me was genuinely glad to see Max thriving. But they also served as reminders of what I'd lost, and gradually, I found myself falling back into old patterns. Not as severely as before Max, but the familiar weight of loneliness began to settle over my life again. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to fill the hours that had once been occupied by walks and training sessions and simple companionship. My apartment, which had briefly felt like a home when Max was there, reverted to feeling like a place I slept and ate. The neighborhood routes we'd explored together became painful reminders, so I stopped walking altogether. Marcus noticed the change when I canceled our regular Saturday afternoon visits. "You need to get out of that apartment," he said during one of his increasingly frequent check-in calls. "Come over. Bring a book. Bring your laptop. Just come sit on the deck and remember what the outside world looks like." But I wasn't ready. The park where Max and I had spent so many mornings felt haunted by his absence. Even seeing other golden retrievers on the street was painful, each one a reminder of what I'd had and lost. 3 months after Max left, the updates from Sarah stopped coming. At first, I assumed she was just busy, caught up in her own life and the joy of being reunited with her dog. But as weeks turned into months with no photos, no emails, I began to worry. Had something happened to Max? Was he sick? Had Sarah decided I was too attached and cut off contact to help me move on? I almost called the Humane Society several times, but always stopped myself. What right did I have to check up on a dog that was never really mine? Sarah owed me nothing, and Max had clearly chosen where he belonged. The silence, painful as it was probably for the best. Winter in Portland felt especially long that year. The rain seemed more persistent, the gray skies more oppressive. I found myself working longer hours, partly because I'd taken on more freelance projects, but mostly because sleeping meant facing the dreams where Max was still curled up beside my bed, still greeting me at the door, still looking at me with those trusting amber eyes. It was during one of these gray February days, almost a year after Max had left, that I made a decision that surprised me. I was walking past a pet store, the first time I'd been near one since Max's departure, when I saw a flyer in the window. Volunteer dog walkers needed. Oregon Humane Society. I stood on that rain-soaked sidewalk for 10 minutes, staring at the flyer, feeling something stir inside me that I'd thought was dead. Not the desire for another dog of my own, but something different. The recognition that my experience with Max had taught me something valuable about scared, abandoned animals. Maybe I could use that knowledge to help others heal, even if I wasn't ready to heal myself. The next day, I called Jennifer. "David!" Her voice was warm with surprise. "How are you doing? How's Max adjusting?" "Actually, Max went back to his original owner almost a year ago," I explained. "Long story, but it was the right thing. I'm calling because I saw your volunteer flyer. I thought maybe I could help with the dogs who are having trouble getting adopted." There was a pause, and I could hear the understanding in Jennifer's voice when she responded. "The ones with anxiety issues? The ones who've been returned?" "Exactly." I started volunteering the following week, spending Saturday mornings at the shelter working with dogs like Max. The scared ones, the defensive ones, the ones who'd learned that humans couldn't be trusted. It was harder than I'd expected, seeing so much fear and abandonment concentrated in one place. But it was also healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was Bella, a border collie mix who'd been returned 3 times for aggression that was actually fear-based reactivity. There was Charlie, an elderly beagle who'd been surrendered when his family moved and decided he was too old to relocate. There was Luna, a young pit bull who cowered in the back of her kennel, convinced that every human approach meant punishment. Working with these dogs didn't replace what I'd lost with Max, but it gave my grief a purpose. Each small breakthrough, Bella taking a treat from my hand, Charlie wagging his tail when I approached his kennel, Luna allowing me to clip a leash to her collar, felt like a tribute to the golden retriever who'd taught me that healing was possible. The work was slow and often heartbreaking. Not every dog found a happy ending. Some were too damaged by their experiences to ever fully trust again. Others found homes only to be returned again when their new families realized that love alone couldn't instantly undo years of trauma. But the successes, when they came, were transformative, for the dogs and for me. It was during one of these volunteer sessions on a rainy Saturday in March that Jennifer approached me with an unusual request. "David, I have a favor to ask. We've got a dog coming in next week that's, well, it's a complicated situation. The owner is dying, and she wants to make sure her dog goes to someone who understands what it means to lose everything. She specifically asked if we knew anyone who'd been through something similar." I looked up from the kennel where I'd been sitting with Rosie, a senior golden retriever who'd been at the shelter for 6 months because potential adopters kept choosing younger dogs. "What kind of dog?" "Golden retriever, 12 years old. The owner is terminal cancer, no family to take the dog. She's been his only companion for over a decade." Jennifer's voice was gentle but direct. "I thought of you immediately, not because I think you should adopt him, that's entirely your decision, but because I think you'd understand what he's going through better than most. 12 years old, the same age Max would be now. A senior dog facing the loss of his entire world, just like Max had when Sarah deployed, just like I had when my life fell apart 2 years ago." "When?" I asked. "Next Friday. Her name is Eleanor Patterson. She'd like to meet you first if you're willing. She wants to make sure—" Jennifer paused, choosing her words carefully. "She wants to make sure he goes to someone who won't give up on him when things get difficult." I agreed to the meeting, not knowing that Eleanor Patterson would turn out to be the neighbor I'd met during Max's early days, and that her dying request would change everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and second chances. When I arrived at the address Jennifer had given me, I realized with a shock that I was standing in front of a house I recognized. The small craftsman-style home next to my apartment building, with the well-tended garden and the front porch swing. Eleanor Patterson was Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who'd spoken to Max and me during our early walks, the woman who'd told me about her own rescue dog and how love could heal the deepest wounds. She answered the door looking frailer than I remembered, her silver hair thinner, her movements careful and deliberate, but her eyes were the same, kind, intelligent, and somehow unsurprised to see me. "David," she said with a gentle smile. "I was hoping it would be you." Inside her living room, lying on a plaid dog bed near the fireplace, was the most magnificent golden retriever I'd ever seen. His coat was predominantly white around his muzzle and chest, with patches of the rich gold that spoke of his younger years. He lifted his head when I entered, and I was struck by the depth of wisdom in his dark brown eyes that had seen 12 years of love and loyalty and were now facing the unthinkable. "This is Henry," Eleanor said, lowering herself carefully into her armchair. "Henry, this is the young man I told you about, the one who loved Max." At the mention of Max's name, Henry's ears perked up slightly, and I felt my heart clench. Of course, Eleanor would remember Max. She'd watched us walk past her house nearly every day during our time together. "I've been watching you for 2 years, Eleanor continued. "First when you were struggling, then when Max came and you both started healing, then after he left and you began helping other dogs." She reached over to stroke Henry's head, and his tail gave a weak wag. "I think you understand what it means to love something completely and what it costs to let go." I knelt down near Henry's bed, and he lifted his head to sniff my outstretched hand. His approach was different from Max's cautious investigation. This was the polite greeting of a well-socialized dog who'd known nothing but love his entire life. When he rested his chin on my palm, the gesture felt like benediction. "He's beautiful," I said, meaning it. "How long have you had him?" "Since he was 8 weeks old. He's been my constant companion through everything. My husband's death, my retirement, my diagnosis." Eleanor's voice was steady, but I could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "I know what I'm asking of you, David. I know it's not fair to ask someone to take on a senior dog who's about to lose the only family he's ever known." I looked down at Henry, who was studying my face with the same intense attention Max had always shown. "What is it you want from me, Mrs. Patterson?" "I want you to let him grieve," she said simply. "The people who've come to meet him so far, they all have good intentions, but they want to fix him immediately. They want to help him move on and adjust. But Henry doesn't need to move on from loving me. He needs someone who understands that grief is the price we pay for love, and that it's worth paying. Her words hit me like a physical blow. This woman, facing her own death, was worried about whether her dog would be allowed to mourn her properly. "I've been watching you walk past my house for 2 years," Eleanor continued. "I saw you with Max, how patient you were with his fears. I saw you after he left, how you honored that loss instead of trying to replace it immediately. And I've watched you at the shelter. Yes, I know about your volunteer work. Jennifer and I are old friends." Henry had moved closer to me, his gray muzzle now resting on my knee. The weight of his head was warm and solid and heartbreakingly familiar. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted. "Max leaving nearly broke me. I'm not sure I can handle losing another dog, especially one who's already 12. Eleanor nodded understandingly. "I thought about that. But here's what I've learned in 73 years, David. The alternative to loving something you'll lose is loving nothing at all. And that's not really living." She reached into a basket beside her chair and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "These are Henry's papers, his medical records, his favorite toys and treats. But more importantly, there are letters in here, one for each month I expect to be gone. Instructions for helping him through his grief, stories about his life, explanations of his quirks and preferences." I opened the envelope and saw a stack of smaller envelopes, each marked with a month. 1 month after, 3 months after, 6 months after, extending out to 1 year after. At the bottom of the stack was an envelope marked simply, "When you're ready to let go." "I don't understand," I said. Eleanor smiled sadly. "I know how much you loved Max, and I know how much it hurt to lose him. Someday, you're going to have to face that grief with Henry too. When that time comes, there's something in that last envelope that I think will help." We spent the next 2 hours together, Eleanor telling me about Henry's life, his routines, his favorite spots in the neighborhood. Henry seemed to understand that something important was happening. He moved back and forth between Eleanor and me, as if he was getting accustomed to the idea that his world was about to change again. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, as I prepared to leave. "The reason I chose you isn't just because I think you'll take good care of Henry. It's because I think Henry will take good care of you too. You've been grieving Max for 2 years, David. Maybe it's time to let yourself heal." 3 days later, Eleanor Patterson passed away peacefully in her sleep. Henry came to live with me on a Tuesday morning, carrying only his favorite blanket and a tennis ball that Eleanor had told me was his most treasured possession. The transition was different from my early days with Max. Henry's grief was profound, but not fearful. He wasn't afraid I would abandon him, but he was clearly mourning the loss of the only family he'd ever known. He spent his first week lying by the front door, not trying to escape, but positioned where he could watch for Eleanor's return. I followed Eleanor's instructions in that first envelope. Let him grieve, maintain his routines as much as possible, talk to him about Eleanor, allow him to be sad. It was counterintuitive. Every instinct told me to distract him, to help him move on, but I trusted Eleanor's wisdom. Slowly, Henry began to accept his new reality. He started eating regularly, began following me around the apartment, even showed interest in walks around the neighborhood. But unlike Max, who'd been learning to trust for the first time, Henry was learning to love again after loss. It was a different kind of healing, gentler, but no less profound. It was 2 months after Eleanor's death that I finally felt ready to visit Max's old drawer, the one he used to scratch at so persistently. I'd been thinking about that drawer a lot since Eleanor's death, wondering about the letter I'd found there, trying to understand how I'd forgotten writing it. When I opened it, I found something new. A small white envelope that hadn't been there before, addressed in Eleanor's careful handwriting. "For David, when Henry arrives." Inside was a brief note that made everything clear. "Dear David, if you're reading this, then Henry is with you and I am gone. I hope you don't think me presumptuous, but I took the liberty of adding to your collection of letters. 2 years ago, after Max left, I watched you grieve and wondered if you'd ever let yourself love a dog again. So I wrote you a letter and asked Jennifer to place it in your kitchen drawer, the one you told me Max always scratched at. I thought when you were ready, you'd find it and remember why that love was worth the pain. I hope Henry helps you remember that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying love forward. With affection and hope, Eleanor Patterson. I sat on my kitchen floor, holding Eleanor's letter, finally understanding the gift both she and Max had given me. The first letter, the one I'd found after Max died, hadn't been written by my past self at all. It had been Eleanor's way of helping me see that my love for Max hadn't ended when he left. It had transformed into something that could help other dogs, other people, maybe even myself. Henry patted over and pressed his warm body against my side, offering comfort in the way that only dogs can. As I looked down at his graying muzzle, I realized that Eleanor had been right about everything. I wasn't replacing Max with Henry. I was honoring Max's memory by loving again, by choosing to risk loss for the possibility of connection. That night, I opened Eleanor's envelope marked 3 months after and found a simple message. By now, Henry should be settling in. He's probably claimed his favorite spot in your apartment, likely somewhere he can see you at all times. This is how dogs love, completely, without reservation, with the full knowledge that loss is inevitable. They teach us that the depth of grief is just a measure of the depth of love. Let him teach you this, David. Let yourself learn it again. As I read those words, Henry lifted his head from his bed beside my desk and looked at me with those wise brown eyes. His tail gave a gentle thump, once, twice, 3 times, a golden retriever's way of saying goodnight, of saying I'm here, of saying love is worth the risk. 6 months later, I still have 10 envelopes from Eleanor left to open, and a lifetime of love ahead with Henry. Max is thriving with Sarah. I know this because she sent me a photo last month of him swimming in a mountain lake, his golden coat gleaming in the sunshine, looking every inch the happy, secure dog he was always meant to be. And I understand now what Eleanor was trying to teach me, that love doesn't end when loss begins. It transforms, deepens, becomes something that can be shared with others who need healing. The drawer in my kitchen no longer holds just one letter. It holds a collection of reminders about the courage it takes to love fully, knowing that goodbye is always waiting somewhere down the road. Henry and I walk past Eleanor's house every morning now. The new owners have painted the front door blue and planted different flowers, but I always pause at the spot where she used to tend her garden, where she first told me that rescued dogs love the hardest once they know their home. "Thank you," I whisper sometimes, and Henry's tail wags softly, as if he understands. Because love isn't about holding on forever, it's about holding on completely while we can, and then carrying that love forward into whatever comes next. In Eleanor's final envelope, the one marked, "When you're ready to let go," I know there's one last lesson waiting. But today, with Henry warm against my leg and the morning sun streaming through our windows, I'm not ready to let go of anything. I'm ready to keep loving, keep healing, keep believing that the best goodbyes are really the beginning of something new.